This is Our People podcast, telling the stories behind South Tyneside and Sunderland NHS Foundation Trust.
Hi and welcome to Our People podcast. My name's Harry Newhouse. I'm a PR and social media assistant here at the Trust, and on today's episode we will be talking about Black History Month, which in the UK is celebrated throughout October. We will find out why people celebrate Black History Month, what the Trust does to support our Black patients and colleagues, plus much more. With me today to talk about this is Vice Chair and Non-Executive Director Ngozi and Lead Chaplain Reverend Remi Omole. Welcome to the podcast, Ngozi and Remi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
No worries. Ngozi, please could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role here at the Trust?
Great. So I'm currently a Vice Chair of our Trust and Non-Executive Director here at the Trust. So this means as part of the board ensuring that we realize our vision of providing excellence in all that we do, both for our staff and for our patients. I also hold a number of roles in the Trust that are relevant to this. One is the Wellbeing Champion. So my role is very much about making sure that our staff feel good, feel a good sense of belonging, are happy and healthy, because you need happy and healthy staff to be able to realize your vision. So I hold a number of roles, but for me it's a real pleasure and privilege to be part of this Trust, and I'm absolutely delighted with all of the work that our staff do to support our patients.
Perfect. And so this episode is part of our big health and wellbeing team talk campaign. As you mentioned there, you're involved with you're the chair of wellbeing. What's involved with that, and how did you get into it?
Okay, I wouldn't say chair of wellbeing. So as non-executive directors, we hold a number of different roles and responsibilities. So that means on behalf of the board, I work with the executive directors, Kath Griffin in this particular case, to make sure that the board is assured that the well-being of our staff are being taken very, very seriously. So it links to our values of compassion, teamwork, honesty, respect, especially respect. So if we're protecting the well-being of our staff, if we're making sure they're happy and healthy, if we're making sure they're not subject to abuse, which some of our staff are, then we can make sure that our staff do feel respected. So that role is very much working with Kath and the team that include Philippa Poole and Jake Higgins to understand what we're doing about the well-being of our staff. Ask the right questions to help us explore it a little bit more and test that the activities that we're doing are very much what our staff need.
And Remi, please could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role here?
Okay, thank you. I joined the Trust in 2014, but I took on my current role as lead chaplain just over a year ago. And from a chaplaincy perspective, we have that strong conviction that people's spirituality or religion or faith has an impact on their well-being and on their health. And what we try to do is to try and make sure that's held within the whole healthcare agenda, that people, staff, families are conscious of the impact of people's faith on their well-being. But not only that, we also offer a lot of emotional support to patients, their families and staff, which has been really evident, especially both prior to COVID, in the COVID period, and most especially now when we're trying to actually kind of exit the COVID period. So we offer a lot of support to people, and that in a nutshell is really what we do.
And you're also co-chair of the BAME Staff Network.
Yes.
What is the BAME Staff Network?
Again, this is a specific area of focus. Now, the Trust has a lot of staff who are non-local, who are foreign, and they constitute a great majority within the Trust. But then leaving one country, coming to the UK, there's a lot of things around support, around culture change and a host of other things. And the network really is there to offer support, to offer guidance, but in many ways be a home away from home. Because what we're not encouraging is for people to ditch who they are. We actually want them to bring in who they are, but support them in a totally different environment. And in essence, that's what we as a network do. And we just have a presence with not only people who class themselves as ethnic minorities, but even people who describe themselves as indigenous people, in terms of how we can make people more aware of what we experience and the experiences of others.
And how can staff get involved with the Wellbeing staff network?
I think mainly the information is on the intranet. A key person is Philippa Poole and Jake Higgins, who Ngozi mentioned earlier on, and their details are all on the website and on the intranet. And I highlight this especially for new members of staff who may not necessarily be aware, to make themselves known so that we can get them registered and offer them support.
So we're here today to talk about Black History Month. First of all, what is Black History Month and why do we celebrate this occasion?
Okay, well, I'll chip in my bit of what I can.
Absolutely.
I mean, historically, a lot of the focus has been on America. So if you go back to maybe, say, 1915, thereabouts, that's where it really started, where people got together and started saying to themselves, we need to actually celebrate the role of African American people in development of our society. And that over time developed and grew. So in America, if I understand it right, it actually happens in February.
That's right.
And in here is actually, we do it in October. But for me, regardless of when it is, let's focus on it. Let's celebrate it. Let's mark it. And I think the month of October, what it does for us, it allows us to pause and focus on those issues that impact on all ethnic minorities. Now that could be good and it could be bad, but it allows us to just stop and focus on it. And the whole idea of this is for us to recognize the contributions that diversity brings in to the workplace, and the NHS is a living example of that.
I'd agree with that, yes. I wish we didn't need a Black History Month, but unfortunately we do. And that's because the contribution of Black people has not been recognized. It's not taught in schools, it's not recognized in terms of society, the National Portraits Gallery, wherever it is, you just don't see very visibly the contributions that Black people have made to community over the centuries. And that is the big gap. So you kind of have little Black children not able to see people like themselves, not able to understand the contribution that they have made. So it's fairly recent, though it's been around since, as you mentioned. It wasn't until 1976 that the US put in a Black History Month, and it wasn't until 1987 that the UK did. So this has not been around for that long. But the more we integrate the understanding of Black history into everything that we do, the more people feel included, the more our society as a whole benefits, because we all do better when we recognize the history, the diversity, and the culture of all of the different communities that make up today's society.
Brilliant. And as a trust, are we doing anything to celebrate this, or have we done anything to celebrate it?
I think from my perspective, rather than what we've done, I like to say, what will we do? Because there's a lot of effort in raising consciousness. And I think it's really important, how do we integrate that into, not only our health care, but I think there's a relational thing, about this. And it's beginning to really be intentional and proactive in beginning to say, what can we really do that leaves a longer lasting legacy, rather than an activity that happens in the month of Black History Month, and then we forget about it. We come back to it next year. I would like us to be doing things that on a monthly basis, that we're integrating it and we're conscious of it. So for example, does the reporting procedure support when someone, feels they've, been racially abused or being treated differently on the basis of their race, or their color? And so there's something about our systems. And another thing I want to add, the importance of self-auditing. So from a management level, right at the top, how do we self-audit ourselves to make sure the trust is living out well-being? Because well-being isn't only about me being well physically, but there's also the emotional bit of it. And having experienced racism is a very wounding experience, emotionally. And that can really impact on people. So the trust needs to consistently self-audit. Are we doing things that are actually meeting the needs of our staff, who are actually the key resource and who can deliver much more if they're looked after?
I do agree with that. So I think there's something about celebrating Black History Month, and maybe the staff network can think about what it wants to do. But for me, it's much more important to have inclusion all the way through.
Yes, that's true.
As we know, people who experience racism, research has shown this impacts on both their mental and physical health. So we need to be mindful of the harm that we do and how we uncover that. But for me, it's the everyday inclusion. So I have the pleasure of working with a woman called Steph Duce. So she's Chief Executive Officer of St. Oswald's Hospice. But she now runs a network called Black All Year, because she was tired of Black History Month and being invited to Black History Month activities. Like, what's happening? I'm still Black in January and February and March. It's not in October. So for me, I totally agree with Remi. We need to be thinking as a trust. How do we make sure we're including everybody all the way through? How do we make sure we're challenging discrimination? So we have a role as a board, as a trust, to make sure that there are mechanisms for people to challenge. But I think everybody who works for the trust should also be challenging. So if you hear something that is discriminatory, something that is unkind, it doesn't even have to be discriminatory, or something that really hurts somebody, how do you challenge that? So we can all be allies for one another. So we're talking about Black history, but there are other needs, be it around gender, be it around people's sexuality, just be it around the way people speak and the way that they engage. That actually, if we're going to be inclusive, then we need to be mindful of all of those different needs and make it day to day. How can we make sure that we all have a sense of belonging? For me, that's really important, the day to day. Not, okay, we'll do it in October, but come November, we'll revert to whatever we were doing before. We don't need to do it anymore.
And I think that's important, because Black History Month shouldn't take away all forms of discrimination. Because sometimes that can happen, and as a chaplaincy, a lot of staff come to us, they tell us of their experiences which we feel shouldn't be happening. And I think it's really important it needs to be across the board and all forms of discrimination, with a support backup to those members of staff.
How does the trust remove barriers for Black patients and colleagues?
I've always said, when I talk around racism, discrimination, I always say the first person to confront is the self. That's the first people we need to confront, our own selves as individuals. Because when we confront ourselves as individuals, we then can confront the other aspects of it. And so first and foremost, the trust needs to kind of look at what's going on, how has it been dealing with things, do that self-audit, and confront the self. When we then confront the self, we can make that live in our everyday existence. Because at the end of the day, why should I think a patient is black or white? No, they're a patient, they're individuals. So I shouldn't even be thinking of colour. But sadly, again, as individuals, we do have those biases and begin to think of who is what or who is whom. It's a patient. And to bring in my Latin here, patient means the suffering one. We're all suffering people. Let's look at each other as human beings and not because you're black, white, or where you come from. So confronting the self for me is a key thing here.
I do agree with that because we all carry biases as part of human nature. It's not necessarily good or bad, but our biases can lead us to make assumptions that might lead us to then discriminate against people. So whilst we're seeing the patient as a whole, it's recognizing that some people have particular needs, be it around interpreting, or, for example, what they eat and so on. So kind of recognizing people's differences, but making sure that actually we're delivering a service that's inclusive. But I also want to talk about what we see as a board in terms of removing barriers. So as you know, the NHS publishes the Workforce Race Equality Standard results. So Kath Griffin and her team brings this to board, and they show us how the trust is doing, for example, around bullying, harassment, people's experiences of discrimination. And there's an action plan attached to that about the different actions that the trust will take to address those results. The staff networks being an example of a great safe space for people to go and interact and be inclusive. But also we have things like our bullying and harassment policy, our grievance policy, and other mechanisms that people can use to address issues that they feel have not necessarily been addressed. But I think often the policies should be the last resort. If somebody experiences something, they should be able to talk to somebody. And I would say, if in doubt, go and speak to Philippa Poole and Jake Higgin or Kath Griffin herself, or myself.
Kath works in HR.
She does, yes. Kath is Executive Director for HR and People. I think that's her job title. I need to check. Well, yes. But absolutely open and willing to speak to people. And it's not just Kath, actually. It's all of the other Executive Directors. They have certainly expressed their commitment to this work, and they'll be very happy for anybody to go and speak to them if they have issues.
As this is a big health and wellbeing team talk special episode, I just want to touch on mental health and the impact racism can have on somebody's mental health.
Would you like to start?
Well, one of the things I'll say is one of the things about, especially when it comes to mental health, a lot of it is around people's lived experiences. So someone isn't just born and then all of a sudden, suffers mental health. There's a lived experience that people go through. Sadly, that's reinforced by people around them or at times people they live with. And then people start developing a strong sense of self. There's that aspect, but then sometimes we spoke about with the different biases we have, without even having any form of mental health, people are already stigmatized because of where they come from, how they look, how they behave. That can actually start causing people, to start going into having mental health crisis because they don't quote unquote fit with other people's expectations. And that's where I always say there are different levels, but more importantly, people's lived experiences can lead them to a mental health crisis. And that's why in the chaplaincy, we're very keen to support people. I have a background as a therapist, so I know that's important. I take things like supervision very seriously because a lot of what I see happening, there hasn't been the space for staff to confidentially say it to someone that, look, this is what I'm going through. A lot of staff can't go to people they feel they should trust. And so they look for other people or suffer in silence or go into addictions. And these are all things that can lead to people, having mental health. That then leads to the impact, family breakdown. If they've got children, what happens to the children? But then at the end of it, there's no intervention, it's the label. And so people start living with those labels. And having worked with young people in the youth offending service, I felt a lot of them have confirmed what people are saying about them. So they live it out. If someone says to them they're whatever, they say, well, okay, I will then live that out to prove that's what I am. So there are different levels of tiers. It's just a whole combination of things in terms of not only how people end up in mental health, but the impact it has on them and people around them.
Yes, sadly, racism does continue to cause serious harm. And I'd like to draw on two pieces of research, one by a group called the Black Equity Organization. It's a report called Being Black in Britain 2022, so it's so recent. And that study found that 65% of black people have been discriminated against by healthcare professionals because of their ethnicity. And it was also in NHS providers' health news just last week, showing that cancer diagnosis is twice as likely to be slow for people from ethnic minority groups than their white counterparts. So there's all sorts of discrimination going on. And then recent research by MAND, the mental health body, found links between racism and anxiety disorders and depression, also psychosis and suicidal feelings. So as Remi has just said, if you're experiencing all of this stuff day in, day out, and worryingly starting at a very young age, then you're carrying all of this baggage as an adult. And if the cycle isn't broken, if we're not supporting and helping people, then they go into serious, higher level mental health problems that then mean they can't function effectively, either as our staff or as our patients. So we've got a duty of care, really, to make sure that we have a zero tolerance against racism, that we challenge racism when it happens on our own shores. And we do everything we can, both as individuals, as a trust, to go, no, we don't tolerate this. We're here to help people, to support them, and we're not here to cause them harm. So that's something I think is really important for us as a trust.
And how does the trust support anyone who's been subject to any racism or any abuse?
So we would use our policies and procedures, first of all, to make sure that matters that are reported are investigated and are seriously addressed. That's one. I think the support bit, the prevention bit, is actually more important for me. So things like the staff network, where people can go and feel safe, share their thoughts and ideas. Things like the work that Philippa Poole and Jake Higgins, so I'm name-checking them a lot on this, because they do really important work, and I'm so grateful for them. We all are as a board on the work they do. But there are lots of training and learning sessions around allyship, which is really important. So how can we be allies to people who are different from us? But also things like inclusion. What does inclusion mean? Things like microaggressions. I don't actually like the word microaggressions, because micro means small, and these are not small stuff if you're experiencing them day in, day out, but also being aware of these issues so that we can do something about it. Things like induction, for example, for newer staff, especially those who are coming from abroad, and all of the support that we put in place to ensure that we don't hit these problems in the first place, but that if we do, people can feel confident that we will handle them very seriously.
Yeah. I'd just like to mention, if any listeners are interested in finding out what Jake and Philippa do, we have got an episode out where they explain what their job is within the it's the EDI, so it's
Yes, that's right. Equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we're moving away from equality, because equality suggests that if you treat people the same, it's fine, but we don't. Because some people just need a greater helping hand. I mean, a very basic example. If you don't have English as a first language and somebody gives you really complex reports with lots of text, lots of technical terms, you're not going to understand it as well as somebody who does have English as a first language. So you might need to look at, translation if you need. You might need to look at more simple texts that can enable people. So I guess equity, in that very simple example, I haven't expressed it well, it's about giving everybody the support they need so that they can engage on a more level playing field.
And I just think the whole area of equity and inclusion is not too... I'm hoping that whole agenda won't be seen as an add-on, because I think not only in various organizations, but in a lot of organizations, it's an add-on. It's got to be seen as the key of everything, So when anyone comes into an organization, I don't have to think about treating them, equitably. It should become as a natural thing. And the baseline should be that you're a human being. I don't need a degree in maths to think that. You're a human being. How can I relate to you based on who you are? Not what I think you should be. But there's something about a lot of organizations, it's an add-on. We'll do things around equity as an add-on. I kind of, struggle with that. It should be a key part and parcel of everything that goes on.
Yeah. And I think the I in inclusion in particular is about this sense of belonging. So people need to come into our premises as a trust feeling that they belong if they're members of staff. And how do we create it so that there are no mismatches between what we say as a trust around inclusion and what people actually experience? So how does it become part of everyone's DNA? So you're thinking this is not just to do with race, it's to do with disabilities, to do with people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, etc. How do we look at people and see their story, their complete story, not the assumptions we make about them and the stereotypes that we want to reinforce? So for me, is that creating a culture of belonging and inclusion where everybody can thrive. And that's the only way we can achieve our own mission in terms of excellence in everything that we do.
If a member of staff is listening to this and has experienced racism or prejudice of any kind, where can they go for support?
As a chaplaincy, we're all open, for people to come to us, knock on our door. If, we're busy, we'll actually make an appointment, and we're actually available 7 days a week, so people can actually come in and see us. If we can't deal with what they bring, we will identify someone they can go to. Again, Philippa, and Jake are also around, or someone from the network, because the advantage of the network is there are people who have different skill sets and who are able to support people who have specific issues. So that's on a broad base. And Ngozi mentioned the policy, so there's a system in place, a reporting and recording procedure that exists, that they can also, complete what's necessary there. So there's something about responsibility also to make sure those things are in the system to then be addressed. Because sadly, if it's not put in the pot, it can't be addressed. And sometimes, and I know from what I've heard, people struggle with putting things based on the system because it should go beyond the system, but sometimes we've got to use systems to work for us in terms of doing what we need to do. And then hopefully the system procedures can take course of action.
And may I just use this opportunity to thank Remi and the chaplaincy for the work you do, because it's absolutely brilliant that people feel that they can receive that degree of emotional support that they might need, both for staff and our patients, because the mind and body connection is so strong. And everything we've just said about health plays into that work, so that's brilliant. But I also want to recognize the idea of psychological safety. So often people who experience racism and other negative isms, the policy is the last thing they want to use because they don't feel safe, that they'll be taken seriously, that it will be investigated, well, etc. And the temptation is to go, well, I'll not say anything, I'll just carry on as I am. So you can imagine the mental load that places on people. So I would say, obviously, the policies and procedures are there, they're good. But you can also speak to your line manager, and if you don't feel able to, speak to their line manager, speak to the executive directors, speak to members of the board, speak to whoever you need to speak to if the mechanisms that we have just outlined are not there. But the thing I would really encourage people not to do is not to say anything and hope it will go away, because if we don't know, then we can't do anything about it. And I would hate to be associated with a trust where people are feeling, oh my goodness, I can't say anything because I don't know that they will listen, because that is so against everything that we're about.
So Remi, you have recently won an award for your anti-racism work you have done here at the Trust and also within the communities. How did you achieve this?
I think the genesis, many years ago, I was part of what was then the Darlington and Durham Racial Equality Council. That, took a different direction, but the then chair, Pat Poynan, contacted me a while back to say that, there's an organisation which is the North East of England African Community Association, which I had never heard of, and they invited me to an event. So I attended that event, and then the award was given to me. So I went there cold, but it was in recognition of my contribution to community cohesion and promoting anti-racism. And so that's been the work that I've been doing. But also, it was a real honour for me, for the first mayor, of Newcastle to present it, Habib Rahman. But also Shaka Hislop was also there, the former Newcastle United goalkeeper, who currently chairs Show Racism the Red Card. So it was really nice to be recognised, but I didn't think I'll ever get an award, and whether I do or don't, my reward is being able to do this work that we're able to do, whether however little, however much, it's about planting the seeds. And that African Community Association was set up to, again, support people, going through discrimination, racism. And so that's how I kind of, got involved.
Congratulations, Remi. That's fantastic news.
What was the award called?
Right, well, I've got the certificate here. It's a Certificate of Appreciation, Community Award Certificate, and it's in recognition and appreciation of your contribution to community cohesion and promoting anti-racism in the UK.
Oh, brilliant, well done.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
And finally, Black History Month is about remembering important Black public figures and events. Has there been a person that has inspired you throughout your life, and if so, who?
I think there are several, but one that stands out is more around, rather than individual, maybe the legacies they leave or the words they leave. And there's someone who's now died, Ralph Ellison, who's an author, and he wrote a book, The Invisible Man. And one statement that stood out for me was part of his quotation, which ended is, realizing that I'm no one but myself. I'm no one but myself. And it's the longer quotation, but that just stood out at me. And I appreciate that, to know that you're yourself, Ngozi herself, and not myself, but the things around racism, discrimination to others, you should be who they expect you to be, rather than who you are. And that's why that quotation and Ralph Ellison is really important to me. And there's so many others, but those are words that I reflect on probably on a daily basis.
And for me, there are lots of public figures, people like Mary C. Cole, we know her well, people like Diane Abbott, who was the very first black MP, people like Baroness Doreen Lawrence, the mother of Stephen Lawrence, who continues to do work. But actually for me, it's about the less well-known people. People like Una Marson, who was the very first black journalist employed by the BBC in 1941, who was a trailblazer that you'll not actually hear about. I think Sir Leonard Henry has just done a documentary about her, which is fascinating. But also people like Arthur Wharton, who was a very good black footballer. He was one of the very first to become professional, who, due to racism, didn't get to play for England and all of these things. So there are people like that. But for me, also real people like Remi, people that do lots of important work on the ground now to kind of create a better future for our children, our grandchildren, and society as a whole, to kind of encourage us to be our best, to do our best so that we can thrive. And that reminds me of a quote by Maya Angelou. I might misquote it, but it's something like, do your best until you know better, and then do better. So this is a learning process for us all, and the more we learn, the better we do, so that we can create an even better future for all of us.
And I definitely echo that we're all learning. We're not saying we've got it. We're all part and parcel of learning. And I definitely echo that.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you very much, Ngozi and Remi, for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of our People podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and check out our other stories. Hit subscribe to keep up with the latest and catch up with what we've been up to on our Twitter, Facebook and Instagram pages. Just search for our name.